Hello, students, and welcome to the second week of English 256. This is a short introductory video, much shorter than the one for the whole class. I'm going to kind of wrap up week one discussion, comment on that, and introduce our main reading for the week, the novel The Sympathizer. You'll notice that the narrator's voice is very unlike Esperanza's. He's kind of well, you'll get to know him, the narrator. I wanted to point out this passage from early on in the novel to kind of comment on his voice, his narrative voice. He writes, Americans expected me to be like those millions who spoke no English, those millions of Vietnamese who spoke no English, who spoke pidgin English, which is a kind of hybrid English and other languages, depending on the region, or accented English. I resented their expectation. That was why I was always eager to demonstrate, in both spoken and written word, my mastery of their language. My vocabulary was broader, my grammar more precise than the average educated American. So if you're reading this book and, like me, have to look up a word from time to time, that's his point. You're feeling it exactly, especially if you consider yourself a somebody who grew up speaking English. If you consider yourself the average educated American, and you find yourself stretching a little bit, yeah, that's his point. For instance, the word crapulent was a word that I learned for the first time. I don't think I'd ever heard it or seen it in print until I read this book. I'm not ashamed to say. But this is his point. So he's up to something with his voice. So pay attention to that. Wanted to introduce you also to a real brief timeline of 20th century Vietnam. This will help you understand where the book begins and some of the history that he refers to throughout. It was a French colony from the late 1800s until 1954, when communist leader Ho Chi Minh defeated the French in a communist insurgency. That's when the country became divided between the North and the South. The USA then aided the South Vietnamese government in a war with the North. That's what we refer to in the United States as the Vietnam War, or the war in Vietnam. That's what was going on there. The North was communist, and we were trying to fight, allegedly trying to fight communism and support an anti-communist regime in the South. As you I'm sure remember from high school history class, the North finally won the war in 1955 or 1975, excuse me, and that's right when the novel begins with the fall of Saigon. After that, refugees from the South flee. Many of them ended up in the United States, although you'll see again from the novel that many ended up in other places. The main reason I wanted to assign this novel, or one of the main reasons, I think it's a great novel and really enjoy it personally and think it has a lot to offer. But I thought for a film and lit class, man, this is so good. Chapters 8 through 11, this film, The Hamlet. It's not a real movie. It's like a blend of many Vietnam movies that were made during this basic time period. And the narrator is, of course, hired to be a cultural consultant or cultural advisor to the movie to make it more realistic. So these are a couple of quotations from that part of the book. He says, he naively believed he could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. So the nursing majors will have to fill us in a little bit more on what lobotomy is, but like the removal of the brain or a lobe of the brain. And you know what pickpocketing is. And then he describes the movie that they're making and the movies that by extension he's kind of saying U.S. Vietnam movies are an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. So this is the critique to look out for. And this is what I want to kind of introduce to you and put in dialogue with the two Vietnam movies, the two U.S. Vietnam movies that we're watching this week, Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket. This is again later on in the novel, in this section on the Hamlet. Perhaps the movie itself, this is the Hamlet, that fictional movie that he's talking about, was not terribly important, but what it represented, the genus of the American movie was. An audience member might love or hate this movie or dismiss it as only a story, wink wink, but those emotions were irrelevant. What mattered was that the audience member, having paid for the ticket, was willing to let American ideas and values seep into the vulnerable tissue of his brain and the absorbent soil of his heart. Typical Viet Thanh Nguyen phrasing there, poetic and fun and critical all at the same time. So this is the big question for this week. Are these movies doing that, letting American ideas and values seep into the vulnerable tissue of the audience's brain and the absorbent soil of our hearts? So I'll let the movies introduce themselves, and then we can put them in dialogue with the sympathizer online. I wanted to comment a little bit on discussion posts from the first week and point out some good habits for discussion posting. You'll also get an individual email or feedback from me about your discussion post from week 1, but I wanted to kind of publicly say some things that I saw going on well in the first week, one of which was this one from Andy's post. You can see a couple times where she quotes from the novel, in addition to making this point that she's making about Esperanza being roughly 12 years of age. Also introducing the textual feedback to say where the idea came from. So I've highlighted and bolded the things here on the page. For example, for starters, those are great introductory phrases, typical phrases that we use to show where we got our ideas. And this is a really great example of this kind of post. Other good things to do in your discussion posts are to use dialogue. Think about it like a class discussion, that you would listen to what somebody else has said and then frame whatever you say in response to that person's comments. For instance, Muhammad says to Andy, "I like the way you use the example of blah, blah, blah." Or Muhammad says to Carolyn, "I had trouble watching Clueless as well, blah, blah, blah." To go on and make his point. But you notice that he frames it as a response to whatever the other person had written. Likewise, Lisette, in response to Muhammad, said, "I agreed with you about Boyhood and the House on Mega Street. I thought they were similar because ... And there she goes on to say how they're similar. Finally, Kaylin was writing to in response to Miles and Muhammad, and you can see that Kaylin has introduced this with, however, in the book when ... Kaylin introduces a kind of critical question there. So these are all really good examples of putting your own ideas in dialogue with somebody else's. I also wanted to urge you to read all the posts when you're responding to a thread. It'll be a little easier in week 2 because I'll have them separated out into smaller groups, so it'll be easier to kind of see what everybody else in the same group is saying. But when you do, reply to the last person in the conversation. Let me show you an example from this one. You can see that Lisette responds, I respond, Muhammad responds to me. That's the kind of shape that our discussion board should have. It's fine to kind of respond to the original post as Andy, Miles, and Kaylin did, but the value and the depth that we can create here is with the kind of indented or nested replies where there's a sense of advancing an idea, advancing a conversation. So be sure to do that in the second week as you respond later in the week to read the earlier posts and respond. All right, I'm very excited to see you in D2L this week. You have the list of stuff to do in week 2 again. Hope you enjoy the sympathizer and the films, and I'll see you soon in D2L.